Have you ever wondered how humanity could accept slavery as normal for centuries? Enslaved people weren't just forced to work, they endured public beatings, cruel punishments, and dehumanizing treatment while crowds watched with indifference. Unlike today's criminals, slaveholders rarely documented their brutality.
Sin. There is no sin. Man does how he pleases with his property.
But the images that do exist reveal the chilling reality of what was justified as economic necessity across continents. These haunting photos offer a rare glimpse into the unrelenting suffering and resilience of those trapped in one of history's darkest systems. How can photographs capture what words often fail to express? Enslaved woman with master's child. Brazil, late 19th century. An enslaved woman sits silently, a white child on her lap. Her attire is deceivingly pristine, a white headscarf carefully wrapped, an off-the-shoulder blouse clean and ironed, her wrists adorned with bracelets, necklaces rest lightly on her chest, and her hands, heavy with rings, cradle the child. Her eyes are fixed on the camera with a somber and empty look. You might think it's a family portrait. It wasn't. It's a carefully staged photograph from Salvador de Bahia in 1870, likely commissioned by the slave-owning family as a keepsake. This photograph attempts to create an illusion of warmth between the enslaved woman and the child she tended, a misleading snapshot that hides a cruel reality. Maria Helena Machado, an expert on Brazilian slavery, argues that these photos were staged to depict a sense of affection that rarely existed. The images were meant to imply that nannies were loved family members, but the truth was darker. Machado asks a chilling question: where are the black babies? She spent years sifting through old court records, piecing together the stories of women like Ambrosina, an enslaved wet nurse. She was forced to feed two infants, her own son Benedito and the white child, also called Benedito. But her milk wasn't enough for both. Ambrosina's son, relegated to drinking unpasteurized cow's milk, suffered while she prioritized her white charge. Exhaustion drove Ambrosina to drastic measures. Desperate to silence the incessant cries of the white baby, she stuffed a cloth in his mouth. The baby sucked so hard that the rag lodged in his throat, resulting in his death. Ambrosina faced immediate punishment, arrest and trial. Her fate remains unknown, her story lost in the records. 92% of wet nurses in Rio de Janeiro were separated from their children. These women were rented out to wealthy families, their own infants left to struggle for survival. It was a booming industry, advertised openly in newspapers. Meanwhile, women were often dressed up for staged studio portraits, photographed as docile and devoted, but these images only added another layer to the haunting history of slavery in Brazil. It was not about love, it was about survival. Australian Aboriginals in prison, Western Australia, 1902. The image is stark. Aboriginal men, shackled in chains, are lined up, their faces a mix of anger, fatigue, and hopelessness. Metal neck chains, as thick as a man's wrist, loop around their throats. Their hands are not restrained, just their necks. This brutal method of control was common in Western Australia. Despite global outcry, these chains remained a fixture of policing for over 80 years. How did this happen? The use of neck chains was often described as unofficial, but it was systematic. Aboriginal people, including women and children, were captured by mounted police and chained, marched for miles away from their lands, accused of cattle theft, or simply existing where they were not wanted. Each chain weighed 5 pounds, their necks bearing the weight as they were marched up to 250 miles. The horrific reality wasn't just about control, it was about convenience. Jails were run down, guards were few, and chaining prisoners ensured they couldn't run. In 1905, a royal commission exposed the use of these chains, sparking global condemnation. Yet a year later, the practice resumed under the guise of necessity, and these chains weren't limited to adults. Children, too, were shackled. In one case from 1953, a schoolmaster at Mula Bulla Station put neck chains on 11-year-old boys as punishment for playing too much. It was meant as a lesson: misbehave, and you will be chained like your parents and grandparents before you. Neck chaining wasn't fully abolished until 1958, when police vans finally replaced chains. The haunting legacy, however, lingers, one of dehumanization, oppression, and a history that Australia is still reckoning with today. Jonathan Walker's branded hand, 1844. A hand appears in the daguerreotype, branded with the letters SS. They burn into the viewer's mind, slave stealer. This image is not of a man forced into servitude, but of a man who tried to end it. Jonathan Walker, an abolitionist, attempted to help enslaved people escape from Florida to the West Indies. The plan failed. He fell ill, the boat was intercepted, and he was thrown into a Florida prison. His sentence was harsh: 1 year in solitary confinement, a $600 fine, and branding. The branding was performed publicly. Walker's right palm, held down as a hot iron, seared his flesh. The letters marked him as a criminal in the eyes of pro-slavery forces. Yet they became a symbol of resistance, used by abolitionists to inspire others. John Greenleaf Whittier, a poet and abolitionist, immortalized the image in a poem. The branded hand, Whittier wrote, would prophesy salvation to the slave. Walker's story did not end with the brand. He became a traveling lecturer, recounting the horrors of slavery, holding up his scarred hand as proof of his commitment. British sailor freeing Swahili slave, Oman, 1907. In the stark photograph, a British sailor leans over, his hands carefully removing a rusted iron shackle from a Swahili man's ankle. The sailor is focused, determined. The shackle is old and heavy, the man's skin raw where the metal has been. This was part of an anti-slavery operation by the Royal Navy along the Bhatineh coast of Oman. Samuel Chidwick, whose father served aboard the HMS Sphinx, recalls that his father saw these slaves escape in a canoe, desperate to reach the safety of the ship. They were terrified but driven by hope. The enslaved men had been trapped in those chains for years. One of them had been manacled for 3 years, unable to break free from the clutches of his captors. The Sphinx crew wasted no time freeing the men, giving them fresh clothes, and offering what comfort they could. A sense of urgency fills the scene. The sailors knew that slave traders would not be far behind. For over a century, the Royal Navy patrolled these waters, capturing slave ships and freeing enslaved Africans. The West Africa Squadron, established in 1808, seized around 1,600 vessels and liberated 150,000 people. But the struggle was constant. In a single 4-day patrol in October 1907, HMS Sphinx rescued 6 enslaved men. The men spoke of harsh conditions, brutal treatment, and years of torment. Slave Deck of the Wildfire, 1860. The scene is both shocking and devastating. The deck is packed with over 500 Africans, rescued from the Wildfire, a slave ship intercepted by the USS Mohawk off the coast of Cuba in April 1860. The people are cramped, sitting shoulder to shoulder, the deck too small for any semblance of comfort. The air is thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and desperation. Lieutenant Tunis Craven of the Mohawk later described it as a dense mass of human beings. When the Mohawk pulled alongside the Wildfire, it was evident what the ship was: a vessel of misery. Manacles were strewn about, hastily abandoned by the fleeing crew. Below deck, there was barely 4 feet of space between the ceiling and the floor, the darkness oppressive. There was no room to lie down, no room to breathe. Survivors of the voyage sat silently, their eyes hollow, their bodies weak. Disease had already claimed many, and food and water were nearly gone. The Wildfire was not the only ship caught that year, but it was one of the largest hauls. Despite U.S. laws prohibiting the slave trade, since 1808, the Atlantic slave trade persisted, driven by insatiable demand in places like Cuba and Brazil. In 1860 alone, American naval steamers captured 8 slave ships and rescued over 1,500 people. But it was often too late for many. By the time the Wildfire was seized, more than 200 captives had already died. The survivors were taken to Key West, where the heat was still merciless, but at least they had fresh air and food. Lieutenant Craven pushed to have them cared for locally, fearing that the long journey to Boston would be deadly for most of them. His reports to Washington were stark. The conditions aboard the Wildfire were inhumane. "They are packed in as dense a mass as possible," he wrote, "without room enough to sleep, with scarcely space to die in." The sight haunted the crew, leaving a bitter taste of victory. Ku Klux Klan's Christmas gift to former slaves, Alabama, 1948. It is one of the most disturbing images ever captured. An elderly black couple sits before a group of Klansmen in Alabama. The man is Jack Riddle, 106 years old, and beside him is his wife, Rosie, aged 86. In front of them is a radio, a gift from the Ku Klux Klan. One Klansman, wearing a white hood and robes, even poses as Santa Claus. The absurdity is stark, a twisted display of mockery and control. The image was taken in December 1948, part of a publicized goodwill gesture by the Klan. Newspapers reported the bizarre scene as if it were charity, but to black viewers, it was a warning. Professor John Giggy of the University of Alabama explains that the photograph captured a fantasy of the Klan, showing themselves as benevolent figures of authority over former slaves. It was an attempt to symbolize the dominance they wished to maintain. The photo's context is chilling. 1948 was a pivotal year in civil rights as the Dixiecrats broke away from the Democratic Party over its increasing support for desegregation. The Klan sought to reaffirm its presence, using gestures like this one to mask their violent history with supposed good deeds. Jack Riddle and his wife were photographed sitting rigidly, their expressions ambiguous. It is unclear whether they were aware of the dark irony of the gift. They had once been enslaved, and now, in the twilight of their lives, they faced their former oppressors again, this time with a veneer of politeness. This photo, taken by a Keystone Press photographer, was a carefully staged event. It was meant to send a message, one of control, superiority, and enduring racism. While the Riddles might have wished for a radio to hear preachers speak of salvation, the Klan's intention was far from noble. They staged the entire scene, creating a grotesque parody of goodwill. African American whipped in prison, 1889. The man in the photograph stands with his back to the camera. His skin is laced with scars, a tangled map of brutal whippings. The image is haunting, a stark reminder that the end of slavery didn't mean the end of exploitation. After the Civil War, the prison system became a new means of forced labor. The scars, eerily similar to those on the back of whipped Peter, symbolize the unbroken cycle of suffering. Peter's photograph, taken in 1863, was one of the first to show the world the violent reality of slavery. Captured by Union soldiers in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Peter had escaped a plantation after surviving a horrific beating. The welts crisscrossed his back, deep and swollen, proof of the overseer's cruelty. Peter had run for 10 days, through swamps and fields, evading bloodhounds with raw onions rubbed on his skin to throw off the scent. His scars, visible in the photograph, were used as evidence of slavery's brutality and as a call to action for abolitionists. But this image from 1889 shows that the horror did not end with emancipation. Instead, it took new forms in the prison system. Chain gangs, convict leasing, and forced labor camps were rampant across the South. African Americans, often arrested on false or petty charges, found themselves back in shackles. The whippings, beatings, and inhumane conditions persisted. The photo of this man's scarred back speaks to a different kind of enslavement, one enforced by law and tolerated by society. The image of Peter's back had been widely circulated during the Civil War. It shocked many white Northerners who had never seen such brutality up close. It was reproduced as a carte de visite, a small, cheap photograph that spread rapidly across the country. Abolitionists used it to fundraise and rally support. The image, which became known as the scourged back, revealed the raw truth. Slavery was not just a matter of economics, but of unimaginable cruelty. Selknam Natives for European Human Zoo, 1899. It is hard to fathom a group of Selknam natives, once proud hunters from Tierra del Fuego, forced to board a ship to Europe. 11 of them, including an 8-year-old child, were taken across the ocean to be displayed in human zoos. They were measured, weighed, and treated like animals. They were forced to perform several times a day, paraded before curious crowds eager to see primitive people up close. This was not an exhibition, it was exploitation. The Selknam were one of the last indigenous groups to encounter Westerners. Known for their resilience, they lived in the extreme conditions of Patagonia. Tall and physically strong, they were skilled hunters who relied on guanaco and sea lions for survival. They wore animal hides and painted their bodies for sacred ceremonies. But when Westerners arrived in the late 19th century, they brought disease, guns, and a hunger for land. The Selknam were hunted, literally. Ranchers offered bounties for their ears, proof of a kill. The Selknam who were sent to Europe had little choice. Lured by false promises or simply captured, they were taken on a journey that few survived. Those who did make it to Europe found themselves in cages, exhibited like animals at fairs and expositions. The man behind their abduction, Maurice Maitre, posed next to them as if he were a circus ringmaster. The Selknam were expected to sing, dance, and mimic daily life, often 6 to 8 times a day. They were given little food and no medical care. Many fell ill, and some died before they could return home. The photograph captures their sadness, their confusion. They are dressed in traditional garb, but the setting is foreign: cobblestone streets instead of grassy plains, curious onlookers instead of fellow tribespeople. Portrait of Renty, South Carolina, 1850. Renty stands before the camera, his eyes steady and full of defiance. He is shirtless, his chest bare, his face framed by the edges of the daguerreotype. This photograph, taken by J.T. Zeiley in 1850, was commissioned by Louis Agassiz, a Harvard scientist who sought to prove racial inferiority through pseudoscience. Agassiz believed that the physical characteristics of black people could be used to justify their enslavement, and Renty, along with his daughter Delia, became unwilling subjects of this racist agenda. Renty was one of 15 enslaved people photographed on Agassiz's orders. The photos were not meant to show their humanity, but to reduce them to objects of scientific study. Agassiz's theory claimed that black people were a separate species, and the photographs were used to support this baseless idea. The images were stored in the Peabody Museum at Harvard, forgotten until 1976, when a staff member rediscovered them. Despite the sinister origins, the photographs are the earliest known images of enslaved people in America. In 2011, Tamara Lanier, a descendant of Renty, demanded that Harvard return the photographs to her family. She argued that the images were not only stolen from Renty and Delia, but that they were still being exploited by Harvard, which licensed the images for use in publications. Lanier's fight continues today, with 43 of Agassiz's descendants supporting her cause. They argue that the photographs were created as tools of white supremacy and should be returned to the descendants of those they harmed. Andrew and Silas Chandler, Civil War, 1860s. It is a famous image. Andrew Chandler, a young Confederate soldier, sits next to Silas, an enslaved man who was brought to the battlefield by his master. Silas is not a soldier, despite the uniform he wears in the photograph. He is Andrew's servant, his role to carry supplies, cook meals, and tend to his master's wounds. Silas was born enslaved in Mississippi in January 1st, 1837, while Andrew was born in April 3rd, 1844, putting 7 years between them, not the 2 years that some myths claim. Silas was not just a passive figure in the war. During one battle, Andrew was severely wounded, and it was Silas who saved his life, carrying him to safety. It is a story that speaks of complex relationships formed under the shadow of war and slavery. Silas's service, however, did not earn him recognition as a soldier. He was merely an enslaved man doing what was demanded of him. Despite claims of black Confederates, there is no record of Silas fighting as a soldier. After the war, Andrew gave Silas a plot of land. Silas managed to build a life for himself and even received a pension, though it was not a soldier's pension. Instead, it was issued under the application of indigent servants of soldiers and sailors of the late Confederacy, a law that allowed servants to collect financial support for their roles during the war. Silas's descendants have spoken about the ways his story has been distorted by those who wish to argue that black people willingly fought for the Confederacy. The reality is much more painful. Silas did what he could to survive in a system that gave him no choice. Former Slave Convention, Washington, 1916. The photograph shows 4 elderly African-American women standing outside the Cosmopolitan Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. They are Annie Parham, Anna Angales, Elizabeth Berkeley, and Sadie Thompson, 4 women who claim to be over 100 years old. They are attending the 54th Annual Former Slave Convention, a gathering that started as a reunion but became a platform for activism. The women wear long dresses, their hair gray, their expressions serious. Each carries a past marked by chains, but here they are, still fighting. The convention is more than a meeting. It is a demand for recognition and reparations. The attendees, some of whom claim to have known famous figures like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman, share their stories of survival. They talk about the struggles that continue long after emancipation poverty, racism, and unfulfilled promises of freedom. At this event, they advocate for pensions for former slaves, a cause that began decades earlier. The issue of compensation had been hotly debated for years, especially after the case of Johnson versus McAdoo, where former slaves sued the government for cotton produced under slavery but were denied. The women in the photograph represent resilience. Berkeley claims to be 125 years old, though the claim seems improbable. Her presence, however, symbolizes the endurance of those who endured slavery's horrors and lived long enough to fight for a better world. They do not gather just to reminisce. They come to organize, strategize, and demand justice. The convention may be small, but it speaks to a larger movement, a struggle that never truly ended, even with the abolition of slavery. Light-skinned enslaved children, New Orleans, 1863. The image is chilling. A group of children, their skin light, their features European. But these children are enslaved. Taken in New Orleans during the Civil War, the photograph was used by abolitionists to highlight the brutal reality of the one-drop rule. The idea that even a trace of African ancestry marked someone as black and therefore eligible for enslavement. These children's faces blur the lines of race, but not the harsh line of status. No matter how they appear, they are still property under the law. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was a common horror in the United States. The light-skinned children were often the result of such exploitation, the children of masters, overseers, or other white men in positions of power. By the 1860 census, 10% of enslaved people were mixed race. Many of these children were still sold like any others, their lighter skin sometimes fetching higher prices. But to abolitionists, their images were powerful tools, a way to force Northern audiences to confront the inhumanity of a system that could enslave children who looked so similar to their own. One of the children in the photograph is Fanny Virginia Cassiopeia Lawrence, a young girl freed in early 1863. Her image was sold as a carte de visite, a small card sold to raise money for abolitionist causes. Fanny's light complexion was used to make a point that slavery did not just degrade the other, but could ensnare even those who appeared white. Her photo, along with those of other children, was part of a campaign to fund schools for freed people in Louisiana, where 95 schools were already operating under Union control by 1863. The photo series of light-skinned enslaved children exposes the hypocrisy of a system built on racial hierarchy. Even children who could pass were trapped by the legal definitions of race. American POWs enslaved by Japan, World War II. In the photograph, American prisoners of war stand in a line, emaciated and exhausted. Their uniforms are tattered, their faces hollow. Captured by the Japanese during World War II, these men were forced into brutal labor camps run by companies like Mitsubishi. They look into the camera, a mix of defiance and desperation in their eyes. This is no ordinary war camp. This is slavery, repackaged and hidden under the guise of prisoner labor. Between 1942 and 1945, American POWs were taken to Japan. They were forced to work in mines, factories, and shipyards, breaking rocks, moving heavy loads, and enduring relentless beatings. The work was grueling, the conditions appalling. There was little food, and sanitation was almost non-existent. POWs shared space with rats, endured untreated injuries, and often fell sick with diseases like beriberi and dysentery. The guards were ruthless. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who resisted were tortured. Mitsubishi was one of the largest corporations that exploited these POWs. At one site, American soldiers were forced to dig for coal in narrow, airless shafts. With every swing of the pickaxe, they inhaled coal dust that settled deep into their lungs. When they emerged from the mines, they were covered in soot, their hands blistered, their backs aching. Despite Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, liberation did not come immediately for these men. Many were forced to keep working until Allied troops arrived. By the end of the war, over 12,000 American POWs had been used as forced labor in Japan, with more than 1,100 dying from starvation, disease, or outright abuse. Mitsubishi's apology, delivered decades later, was accepted by only 2 surviving former POWs. But for many, the damage was irreversible, a lifetime of physical and mental scars. Zanzibar Slave Boy, circa 1890. The photograph shows a young boy standing in the streets of Zanzibar. A thick log is balanced on his head, its weight pressing down on his small frame. A heavy chain connects the log to his ankle, restricting his movement. He is just a child, no older than 7, yet he has already learned the meaning of cruelty. The boy's punishment is severe, carrying this log for hours, sometimes for days, to prevent escape after a failed attempt. Zanzibar, a crucial hub in the Indian Ocean slave trade, was known for its brutal treatment of enslaved people. Runaway slaves were often recaptured and publicly punished as a warning to others. This boy's fate is not unique. It was common to see such scenes in the streets, young boys and girls bearing heavy burdens as punishment. Slavery had been officially abolished in Zanzibar by the British in 1873, but the practice continued, hidden in plain sight. The log, weighing over 30 pounds, was meant to break the spirit as much as the body. The man who took this photograph, Reverend W.K. Firminger, later helped secure the boy's freedom. But for many others, freedom was a distant dream, never realized. Brazilian man carried by slaves, Bahia, 1865. The image is almost surreal. An upper-class man sits comfortably in a sedan chair, shaded from the sun. 2 enslaved men, muscles straining, carry him through the bustling streets of Bahia, Brazil. Their bodies are bent under the weight of the chair, sweat glistening on their skin. The man holds a parasol, indifferent to the labor beneath him. This scene reflects a common sight in Brazil, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Only in May 13, 1888. In the 1860s, Brazil's economy still depended heavily on enslaved labor. Men like this were transported through the streets as a symbol of status. It wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was a statement of power, of control. Slaves carried the weight of their masters, literally and metaphorically. It didn't matter if the streets were muddy or if the day was hot. The slaves were expected to endure it all without complaint. Even as international pressure grew to abolish slavery, Brazilian society clung to the practice, finding ways to justify it economically and socially. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.